Hey, Philip.
Hi, Graham. Are you
Can
okay?
you, can you hear me okay?
You just fine. So for those that are watching along, two options: either just watch the chat we're having, or if you want to watch the episode in the background, just to perhaps guide some questions or some recollections, or just to sort of because I will be referring to the episode a little bit as we go along, so it might be useful to have the episode to hand. If you want to do that version, I just want if you want to pause on the opening shot, which is Edward Pepperbridge, the archer, in the amongst the trees. And I'll do a countdown for five, and then we'll all press play together. Just get one ready. Hey, so five, four, three, two, one, and play. So, the first question I want to ask you, Graham, what made you want to get in the film business first of all, and particularly what made the editing part of it appeal to you?
Well, I grew up in Sydney in Australia, and I was studying medicine. And medicine led me to the film business, funnily enough. Um, so I never finished my medical degree. Unfortunately, I wish I had, but I didn't. But I was living near the only film studio in Australia, which was called our Transit Park Studios in Sydney. And it wasn't very far from where I lived. And I was always interested in photography as well as medicine. So during a summer vacation from university, I went up there and asked if I could have a summer job. And they put me on a documentary which was about sharks, not surprisingly, being in Australia. And I enjoyed it so much that I went back the next year in the summer for the holidays. And then I was offered a permanent job at the studio as an assistant editor. Uh, and I managed to turn that into a self-proclaimed film class, in as much as I convinced them to do if they would let me spend 3 months in every single department in the studio. So I did everything. I makeup, hair, wardrobe, special effects, cinematography, sound, everything for 3 months. And I settled on editing because it seemed like where you could do the final rewrite. And it allowed it had more to do with the structure and storytelling for me than any other component of the film business. So, and it was the storytelling and the structure that interested me the most. So that's how I and so that's how I wound up. I started editing and went proceeded on from there.
We've just seen the freeze frame for the episode with the dive into the pool and then being hit by the arrow. I think it's quite interesting that you slow the dive down a little bit, probably just to emphasize that he's being hit by the arrow. So, how much of that kind of stuff is in the script? How much can you kind of say, well, this is going to be where we're going to have the freeze frame to the titles, etc.
Well, I don't know, Philip. I mean, you and I were talking privately earlier. All this happened 48 years ago. So
Yes.
my memory from 48 years isn't as good as it. Mind you, I have tough trouble remembering next last week, but I think those kinds of things are not usually in a screenplay. Those kinds of things you do either yourself just to because you feel it's a good thing to do, or or you in conjunction with the director, you both come up with it together, or maybe he or she comes up with it. It can be any number of things, or it could be the producer for that matter. I don't remember whose actual idea it was. That kind of thing would probably be mine, because it's purely visual, and I probably would have done it as for the reasons that you suggested, that so that you see the arrow. And I like the fact that, if I remember correctly, that the body is halfway into the pool when it freezes. Correct?
Yes, that's correct. Yes.
So yeah, I don't know. So the answer is I don't know, but probably me.
it certainly was a trademark of the series that the title the pre-credits would end going into titles on a piece of action. It would be somebody kicking a door down, diving into a pool, jumping off something, and that was kind of the hook, if you like, to.
Right. And I remember the first few episodes before they came up with the new title sequence. It was always a freeze frame on that car going over the cliff and exploding. That was always the end of the title sequence, which I thought was rather good. And yes, so when you come onto any series as an editor, your job is to study the series and try and make yourself familiar with what everyone's done before. So the fact that the freeze frame was part of their scheme of things was not lost on me. So I would use that probably had a great deal to do with why I used it.
And would you have were you familiar with the original Avengers series, and would you perhaps have a look at that to guide you, or?
Oh no, I was a big fan of all the original series. The Emma Peels were. Oh, by the way, was this the first series of the New Avengers?
Yes, the New Avengers ran for two seasons. So this was the first time the Avengers have been back on the screen for about 7 years or so since the
That's
show.
right. And,
Since
and and how many episodes did they do per season?
well, they intended to do 26 in the first series, but there was money problems,
Right.
and I think also some tonal things they wanted to change, perhaps. So they stopped at 13. So more perhaps what you might associate with modern day series, and
Right.
that now
Right.
they're getting even shorter. And then they
Yeah.
came back the next year for another 13 that had even more money
Yeah.
problems, and then they could never get the money back, and it was kind of a doom show from the start in some
Yeah, I
ways.
remember now that you mentioned it, I remember the money problems. I'd forgotten about that. I mean, I never knew the specifics of it, but I knew there was a problem, and I thought it was probably 13. I remembered 13. I'm now a big devotee of slow horses. So so they only do six, which is unfortunate. But I gather there's a new series of slow horses out now. We haven't had it here yet, but I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, 13 does sound quite luxurious by 2024 standards, certainly when you get in six or maybe 10 if you're lucky.
Yeah.
Because of course the series was based at Pinewood Studios, and they used a lot of the studio gardens, corridors, etc. And I think there was an element of penny pinching, perhaps because of the budget issues, but also a lots of series just made you make use of what you've got, don't you, to keep because you spend the money elsewhere.
Yeah,
So I
you
don't
do
think that
unless
necessarily.
you do unless you've got tons of money, in which case, and it's a super. But to answer your first question, I was a big devotee of the Avengers from day one, and saw practically every season. I think, not necessarily every episode, but like every other um, like every other guy on the block, I was a big fan of Emma Peel.
Yeah, I think people's idea of the Avengers, because it was interesting with the Avengers, and I mentioned this on previous events that I've done, is that the Avengers always changes. So it starts off with it's the black and white years of Ian Henry, and then on a Blackman, Emma Peel, Tara King. So it's a show that it never, if you were to say let's remake the Avengers, I'm not sure what you
Hmm.
would do because it's always mutating.
Yeah, it was, and I always remember it, funnily enough, as black and white. I mean, the earlier versions, the black and white appeals to me. It still does.
I think black and white is something very visually satisfying about something in black and white, and I
Yeah.
think a lot of fans will like the Doctor Who. The old black and
Right.
white stuff is perhaps considered to be the best. Some purists don't even watch anything further than that, and
Right. So,
but
as soon as it turns to color, you switch off.
yeah, I think there's maybe just sort of a sense, and also of course it's maybe also because it's shot on videotapes. That's a bit different to obviously
Yeah.
working on films. Maybe there's just something special about the black and white quality, maybe the storytelling that was was done in those days, perhaps.
Yeah.
Did you ever editing? Did you ever edit anything that was in black and white or?
Yeah, I mean, I did, before I started editing drama series, which I started at the BBC. I edited a lot of documentaries, and I directed a few documentaries, and they were all in black and white.
Is there much sort of difference in terms of working on the two formats?
Not really, not from an editing point of view. No, I mean, I guess in color you tend occasionally to match things cutting wise from cut to cut if there's a reference, if there's a reason to refer to color, you can cut using, like, for instance, the red curtain behind you. You can use other red images within the frame. Like, for instance, I edited "Don't Look Now," which was all about that little red lady, and so that would not have been the same movie without color, actually.
Yeah.
Because the red image began at the very beginning with the slides, with the film slides,
Yes, it's a good point. In terms of, as you mentioned, it's 48 years since the episode was made. So when it comes to finding people that involve these shows, it is quite a losing battle.
It's a losing battle for me to find most of my friends now.
I can imagine how you feel, but there is three people left from the episode. Robert, part two, we just saw as the working in the morgue. Edward Pepperidge, who's I think 93, he's plays the Archer. He's still around.
Oh, is he?
And Annabelle Leventon, who plays Wendy Clifford, Mark Clifford. So one of the politicians that's taken out replaced.
His wife, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, now, funnily enough, that leads me on to just a quick thing. Brian Clemens, when possible, would always use people's names from people he knew. So as soon as I came on to edit the series, he named a character Clifford right away.
I did notice that. I was wondering whether that might have been
that was entirely intentional,
right.
but he didn't tell me. And then in one of the episodes, there's a close up of the street sign. I might have been in Sleeper, which has Pembroke Avenue, and up in Pemberton Avenue. And Pemberton's my wife's father's name, and and we go on from there. There's another one that I can't remember right now, but there is another family name used by him in another episode somewhere.
Well, yes, that's very interesting. Out the three actors I just mentioned, they're all still around, all still contactable. None of them are interested remotely in talking about the new Avengers, which is odd.
Why was that?
Well, I think Edward, has had quite a distinguished TV career, and I think theatre as well. But if you look at his CV, this is probably the thing he's done. Strangely enough, that perhaps has the broadest appeal, and I wonder whether some actors get a bit frustrated with everybody saying what was New Avengers like, what was Bond like, what was that. I think Diana Rigg had a very much a love-hate relationship with some of her biggest successes because maybe they dwarfed from other stuff they were more proud of. So sometimes I think they can either can embrace that and get and go along with it, or they can get a bit sort of standoffish.
I actually don't mind doing that. I understand that. I do get sick of talking about certain films in my oeuvre, but I haven't been asked to do anything about the Avengers for many years. So I was very interested to hear from you and to reacquaint myself with those early years, because it's a long time ago, and it was one of my first experiences with dramatic series overseas. Everything I'd basically done much of what I'd done before was in Australia.
And I think also in the case of Edward, he did say to me that he didn't find his character particularly interesting when he
Oh,
heard the episode. He thought it was, and I think it's actually quite a good villain in many ways. But maybe if you're, you know, it's not Shakespeare, is it? So
no.
it's kind
No,
of
in fact, some of Brian's lines are certainly not Shakespeare.
well, not to say that he wasn't a great writer, because of course he
Yeah, yeah, and
he
and
was.
he gave most of them to Gareth.
Oh yes, yes. Um,
But anyway, I don't I like this episode because I find it satisfyingly confusing.
yeah,
In as much as towards the end, I tried to edit it in such a way that you weren't really sure whether you were seeing the real person or not. And watching it again recently, um, again I wasn't, because I don't remember lots about the editing of these early episodes, but I was pleasantly confused myself as to whether I was watching the original person or the fake, and I thought that was very valuable to the episode.
oh absolutely. And I think we as the audience we very much see it through Purdy's eyes. We're seeing her. It can you know, we know probably that Gambit and Seed aren't dead, because we know there's a next episode in the Radio Times. You know, so we know it's coming back. But yeah,
Right.
we kind of are. So I think that's interesting. That's something that you wanted to get across was, and I think it does work very well.
Yeah. Worked better than I thought it did at the time.
And I think it was quite interesting. It was quite nice to see London, but back in '60s and '70s, how quiet it is.
Yeah.
And there was a nice sequence we just watched where there's a chase through Covent Garden, which of
Right.
course would have been done quite early in the on a Sunday morning, no doubt. But you know, to do that today, I think would possibly be impossible, perhaps.
It would impossible. Yeah, it's like going to Venice nowadays and trying to find any moment, day or night, summer or winter, when it's not crowded with people.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the interesting elements that struck me when I watched the episode was when the original person encounters their double. There is this quick back and forth of on them on the double to sort of illustrate exactly what's happening. I think that is quite a good device.
Yeah, yeah. No, I was satisfied with that as well. Once again, I don't know whose idea that was, but I'll take the credit unless someone else jumps in.
Oh yeah. Why not? It's directed by James Hill. He
Yeah,
did two new Avengers, Persuaders, original Avengers, The Saints, a very established television director by this time. But of course, you wouldn't have met him at all, would you? I take it.
what, James?
Yes, or did you?
Oh, well, you have to meet the director because you spent God knows how many days in the editing room together.
Ah, because the reason why I wasn't sure was that I know that some programs were when the direct, director handed it in. On some shows, it was then given to the editor, the composers, etc., and they didn't really have too much to do with it. So
Well,
that's
that's still,
interesting. That
I think that's pretty much still the case. But and a lot of that is dictated by the director himself. If he's going from one episode to another episode to another episode of other series in this country, you know, once again, but in this country, most television episodic directors bounce around all over the place, and so James may have had something lined up immediately after directing this episode, in which case I would have spent minimal time with him. But if the director isn't doing anything directly afterwards, they hang around as much as possible. That's if they care about what they're doing. A lot of television directors, I'm sorry to say, don't. They come in, they direct their series, they go home and play with the dog. So it's not. I was the opposite. So um, technically, what happens is when you finish directing an episode, you have a certain number of days to deliver your cut. and that varies from series to series. So James or any director would come into the editing room immediately after the finishing shooting, literally the next day, and spend a minimum of a week with me in the cutting room, generating the director's cut. He would look at what I'd done because I kept up with the shooting. So pretty much the day after they finished shooting, I'd had cut the entire episode. And then he would come in and look at it and think, "Oh my God, this is a disaster," which is what every director says, including me, when I see my first cut. And then the two of us would have worked on it for a week or so, and then he would have run out his time. They'd say, "That's it, you're off." And then we would show it to the producers, and then the producers would take over, as you say, and then they would say that we want to do this and this and this, and we want to change this about, and Laurie Johnson was already working on the music, and that's how it happened. So the director, once the director hands in his cut, unless the producers ask him to come back, he's usually finished.
Because I did a number of events with Ray Austin. He did quite a few Avengers, and
Yeah.
he never supervised his edits, simply because he was too busy. He was passed on something else, and he had to sort of trust that it was going to be, what he wanted, really.
Yeah, well, that's what I said. There were directors who worked that way, and then there were directors who deliberately did not sign up for another episode until they had actually finished their stint on the previous one. I think my opinion is, I'm not criticizing Ray personally, because many directors do this and did this, but I think that is not the way to hand in your episode. I mean, I think it's your job as the director to stick with it as long as possible and make it as good as possible and make it represent what you want as good as possible. And you can't do that if you're not involved in the editing.
I think with the case with Ray, he was very much involved in the second series, and at that point, Brian Clemens and Albert Fennell were setting up the professionals, and
That's
they
right.
had to, because of the financial arrangements, some of the episodes had to be shot in France, some had to be shot in Canada.
Right.
And Brian and Albert didn't have the time to do that. Ray was shooting his episodes and then
Oh, I
going
see.
to France and then producing the Canadian one.
Oh, I see. Okay. Well, then
so
I
quite
apologize to Ray.
literally.
I didn't. So I apologized. I apologized to Ray. I didn't realize that was going on. I was not involved with the second series at all. The second bunch of episodes at all. So I knew that, just from social contact with Brian and Laurie Johnson, that things were not going smoothly, but I wasn't involved. So, and I didn't know Ray was involved to that extent either.
Oh yeah, he was. A lot of it landed on his plate,
Yeah.
and because they'd known him since the
Yeah.
original Avengers, of course they trusted.
Of, of course, yeah.
So would you have liked gone to the second series? Was there a reason why you didn't go back, or?
I can't remember. I have no idea why I didn't go back. I mean, I probably, I don't know. I don't know what I was doing immediately after that, and I haven't looked up my history to see what came next. But probably I might have gone back to America, because I think it might have been around the time I got involved in McCabe and Mrs. Miller with Robert Altman.
Right.
I don't know.
Just having a little look on so you did the New Avengers 76,
Then what?
Fist in 78, Barnaby Jones, 2 episodes of that series, 79.
Yeah, well, you see, I went back to because I was living in America when I came to England to do the Avengers. The Avengers, by the way, has a special significance for me because it's where I met my wife. Excuse me. She was booking musicians. She was working with Laurie Johnson on the music. And it was Laurie, wasn't it, who did the music?
Yes, yes, yes.
She was working with Laurie, and that's how we met. So we're still together.
Oh, fabulous.
So I was so the Avengers to me have a very soft spot in my heart, you know. But I remember going back. I was Norman Jewison had asked me to go back to Los Angeles to edit Fist, and because his regular editor, whose name I don't remember right now, but a very well-known editor, was not available. He was still on another project. So I went back to Australia and back to Los Angeles and edited Fist. That's where I would have been during the course of the second series of the Avengers.
Yeah.
And then oh God, I still can't remember his name. The other editor came in and we finished it up together. But essentially, I cut most of Fist before the other editor rejoined, so to speak.
So you mentioned, of course, that you started off at medical school. So when you had this dramatic change, how did your parents respond to that? Were they a bit?
Well, not very happily,
No.
because in Australia the film business was not considered to be a career, and it was not called the film business because there was really no business. There was one studio in the entire country, which happened to be, fortunately, in Sydney, and they were doing some series and a couple of movies, as I recall, mostly in black and whites in those days, and I sort of got sucked into it. You know, I mean, it became much more enticing to me than medical school. So my father was horrified, and I had a tough time with him for 3 years or so after I decided to bail out of and not go back to university. But he finally came around, and when I had directed Francis with Jessica Lange and Sam Shepard and whatnot, and I had to go to Australia for a big campaign, PR campaign, and he saw my picture on the front of the Sunday Telegraph. He he finally saw that my life had not been thrown away.
You got redemption in his eyes.
I was right. I found redemption, exactly.
Were your parents in the medical profession, or was it kind of?
No. My father was an auditor, and my mother never worked really. She was in those days, a couple could earn enough money from one person's salary. Typically, a lot of women were homemakers, and that was what they want. A lot of women just didn't want to do any more than that, quite frankly. They didn't want to subject themselves to the workaday world, and they had a good thing going for them as far as I'm concerned. And they but you know, nowadays young people can't make ends meet even with both of them working.
Yes, it's very very different, isn't it? I mean, I always we all have a dream of being a kept person and everything, but in reality, these days it's not really possible, sadly.
They can't afford to buy a house or anything, you know. I mean,
No.
I don't recall it was ever that difficult for me to buy a house. We had to save up and be careful about what we were doing, but it was always possible.
Oh, yeah. It's a different different time, sadly. And I think maybe there's a nostalgic element to these shows as well. Sort of, the Avengers is always something that's almost in a sort of heightened reality. It's like watching a Richard Curtis film. That version of London doesn't exist, but people may think that's what life was, and everybody went around in nice suits like John Steed and all that sort of thing. But of course, it's a fantasy even back then, I guess. But
Yeah, well, John, I mean, Patrick retired here, by the way. He retired in Palm Springs, and my wife and I would often go to visit him. Usually once a year, we drop in on him, and it was really nice to maintain that relationship many years after the shooting of my episodes.
That's lovely. Because I think sometimes with the film bit, it's very sort of compartmentalized in the respect that you see people and then you go away and never see them again, or you see them 10 years later, you pick up conversations. It's
Yeah,
quite difficult to kind of keep those kind of relationships going sometimes.
it is, and also that I found that surprising and somewhat distressing, because there's a lot of people that I know I should have kept in touch with, but you just don't. You can't. There's only a certain number of hours in the day, and you can't sort of keep in touch with every single person, you know. But I recently edited a play, Rabbit Hole, with Catherine Ross, and it was nice to. And now I do keep in touch with her, which is good.
Okay, good. You mentioned that the film industry in Australia, of course, now it's a huge industry, and you watch any big Hollywood film, and Australia, it's always
Right, everywhere. Yeah.
so I think if people go into it now in Australia, if they didn't want to go to medical school, it might be seen as more of a less insanity, perhaps, than it would have been in the 60s or 70s.
Right. Well, when I left to come overseas, it was considered a dereliction of duty to leave Australia to come to America. I got some bad press about that, because there was no interaction between here and there at all, except I think Peter Weir was the first one to sort of break that down with Picnic at Hanging Rock.
Because of course, in order to pursue your dream, there was no other choice but to leave. Really, was there? You had to sort of go to Los Angeles, I suppose, was the obvious choice.
Well, I didn't see it that way at first, because, of course, when I left Australia, I went straight to London, and I worked for the BBC for several years,
Right.
and then I went to Los Angeles, and then I would come backwards and forwards between Los Angeles and London frequently, to like, for instance, to edit Don't Look Now. I came back to London from LA to do that. Right before that, I had been doing McCabe and Mrs. Miller with Julie Christie and Warren Beatty. I was the assistant director on that, and the casting director. Bob Altman would assign you several occupations, and Julie was the one that suggested I should come back to London and do Don't Look Now. So she instigated the introduction between myself and Nick Rogue. And so, that's how the business works. So lo and behold, then I was back here again.
When you were with the BBC, was it you went for their training programs and that sort of thing? Is that?
No. I was already editing in Australia.
Yeah.
So I went to the BBC and asked for a job. I was told in Australia I would never get a job at the BBC. I'd have to wait 10 years. And funnily enough, probably dependent upon timing, I got a job immediately. But I said to them, I've done this more than once in my career. I've taken a backward step in order to move forward. I told the BBC that I'd be happy to work as an assistant editor if they did not have an editing position available, which of course they took me up on that right away and gave me a job as an assistant editor. And then within a year I was editing. And then I went to Canada and worked for the CBC for a few years. And then I met Bob Altman in Canada. He came up to do a movie called Cold Day in the Park with Sandy Dennis. And he brought me back down to Los Angeles to help finish the editing, even though I was not in the union. I did some sort of behind the scenes editing without getting credit, of course. And then I stayed here in Los Angeles pretty much full time ever since, except going back to England to work with Nick Rogue twice and things like that. And Images was a picture I cut for Robert Altman, and we shot that in Ireland, and I edited that in London.
And what was Robert Altman like as a person, and as director?
Fabulous. I mean, he and Nick Rogue are the two directors that I worked with over the course of my career that had the most influence on me. Bob was very much taught me how to work with actors and how to give them space and how not to tell them what to do all the time. And lay back. He said that the best directors are the ones who do very little directing unless they're called upon to do so because the situation requires it. And then Nick Rogue was taught me most about what I would call the grammar of filmmaking. He was very much involved in the technique of putting the film together. So he was a good director to have in the editing room.
Because Nick Rogue, among his many highlights, he did work on the original Casino Royale, the David Niven.
That's right.
It says, well, which if you were to describe any production as a shit show, I think you might say Casino Royale was that picture. So that's basically how
I've worked on a few shit shows, Philip.
Oh. But I mean, that had 5 different directors, and it was kind of
I know.
strange ones. So Nick was very good in terms of under pressure, because I imagine that film would have been particularly.
Well, you see, the reason I really wanted to work with Nick is the minute that Julie suggested it to me was because he had just finished Walkabout prior to this, which I love that movie.
Good film, isn't it?
Yeah.
Just to mention, so you said you probably would have worked with the director James Hill on this episode.
Yeah, there's no doubt I would have. I don't recall any of the directors I worked with who disappeared immediately after filming finished.
Right.
So they were all, if in my recollection, they were all part. They all delivered their cut, the director's cut.
So you knew very much what they wanted, but
yeah, and you know what they want as an editor, because I would go to the set every day, and I would talk to the director, and he would, even if we weren't watching dailies together, or we would communicate, and he'd say, I'm shooting this because of this, and then I want to do this, and in this sequence I'd like to do this, and this is what I intend. And so you'd get verbal instructions on what the director had in mind and why he was shooting it the way he was shooting it. So you had that going in, and if I didn't get that voluntarily, I would ask for it.
So you would occasionally have been on set for the shooting of these episodes, potentially?
Well, I'd be there for about an hour or so every day. Some days I would miss if I was getting behind. It was more important to me to stay up with the filming, so that when he finished filming, the director, I was ready to go. He wasn't waiting for me to finish the cut.
So you were instinctively getting
or the assembly. Oftentimes the editor's cut is not referred to as a cut; it's referred to as an assembly. But I never looked at it that way. I always looked at it as if all went wrong, they could use my cut, the editor's cut, as the final cut, because I took a lot of time overcutting it.
Right. And do you, when you're editing, do you have communication with the sound department, Laurie Johnson? Are you thinking about how the other elements are going to kind of fit into it?
Yeah, well, when I started directing, when I did Francis, for instance, John Barry did the music for me, and I had him involved way before I even started shooting. So he and I would be having music conversations whilst the script was still being written, and he was reading the different drafts of the script. I mean, John was also a detail-oriented person like I am. And so by the time I started shooting, he almost had the theme and it mapped out, before we shot a single frame. So yes, I mean, I stay in touch with people. I stay in touch with the production designer quite a lot, funnily enough, as well. And was Sid Kane, wasn't it, on most of the Avengers?
Yes, he did. Sid Kane did do a lot of them. And of course he did Bond films and all sorts of
Yeah,
on the project.
he was a very good production designer, and they were lucky to have him actually, because he did a fantastic job for me anyway when I did Sleeper.
Yeah, and
And
he did Faces as well.
yeah.
What was Sid Kane like as a person and to work with?
Well, I don't know what he was like to work with, because my conversations with him were all about the sort of artistic look of the film that he wanted, and again, I talked to him because not for specific things, but just because talking to him filled me out on what his image and take on the episode was, and what he was aiming for. And a lot of times with episodic, as you can imagine, everyone's running around like chickens with their heads cut off. So they don't. There's not a chance. There's not as much chance for interdepartmental communication as there is with a theatrical movie, where you spend a lot of time discussing the movie before you start shooting, etc. The directors come on episodic. They have about 2 weeks preparation, and then they're thrown in. So the editors are around longer. Obviously, they go from director to director. So I had more time to talk to Sid about the overall look and feel of the episode of the series from his point of view. I was more or less talking to him about the series, whereas with each director, I was talking about that particular episode.
Yeah, yeah. I think why these shows stand up, for many reasons, is because they were made by filmmakers. They weren't,
Yeah.
you know, feature writers, feature directors, but the best of actors, character actors, etc. And of course, production design, Sid Kane, for example.
Yeah. And Albert Fennell, Albert Fennell approached me about coming in and editing some. I mean, he asked me to come in to the Avengers and edit. I didn't apply for a job. So, and because my wife was working with them already, I sort of, turned that slightly to my advantage by saying, yes, I'll be happy to do that, but I want I'd like an episode to direct as well. And they agreed to that. So I came in and did the 4 episodes and then directed Sleeper. But I think they wanted, I don't know, I can't remember the real story. I don't remember any of the other editors on the series, but I guess they were introduced to me because of Patricia, and so actually, I led you wrong earlier. I'll correct it in a minute. But anyway, so I came in at their request and edited 4 episodes and then cut one. And I made a mistake before, because I'd forgotten I had met Patricia when I was editing the Rocky Horror Picture Show, and she was working at Elstree on another movie with Laurie Johnson, I think, but it wasn't the Avengers. And then she went on to the Avengers with him, and so we were already together before the Avengers. I just gave the Avengers credit for joining us together, but it was the Rocky Horror Picture Show that did that.
But the Avengers helped keep you together. So
Yeah, right.
And I mean, everyone always talks a lot about Brian Clemens and his role to the Avengers, but Albert Fennell, I think, sometimes gets a little bit pushed to one side a little bit.
Yeah, Albert was the sort of the father of the group. I mean, he would hold everyone together. Brian was the creative wheel, and he wrote most of the episodes, as you know. And I noticed there was a guy named Spooner. I don't actually remember him, but did he do? Did he do Faces? Did he co-write Faces?
Co-wrote it, yes, with Brian.
Brian.
They had a very close relationship. They would do a lot together.
So what was Spooner's first name?
Dennis.
Dennis. Was he involved in the first series of the Avengers?
I think he was. I'll have to look that up. I should know, because his daughter Elaine Spooner sometimes watches these events, either joins us or watches them on on YouTube. She's a lovely lady, and she's very interested in her father's work, because Dennis sadly died at 57. So she never knew him, obviously as much as she would have done otherwise. So I think she's very interested in his work, for that additional for personal reason. But Dennis did a lot of the New Avengers, and I think the way that they worked was that, I mean, obviously Brian was more of what you would call a showrunner these days. So
He was, yeah.
what script came in, Brian would do a polish of it.
Yeah, but Brian was, I mean, he was amazing. He was not only the showrunner, but he wrote most of them on his own. I mean, he never stopped working. I mean, you could call him at 2 in the morning and he'd be writing. He was an amazing amount of energy, and as I say, he was the sort of the creative force, and Albert was the holding it all together force and the trying to find the money force.
Yeah, Dennis Spooner died at 53, not 57. 53.
But that's young. That's young.
And he did 9 episodes of New Avengers, did things like Jason King, The Protectors, Ran Hopkirk, he created that show. The Champions, again, he's credited as creating. Doctor Who, the William Hartnell stuff he did. But I don't think he did the original Avengers, from what I can see as a quick Google.
I hope his wife was watching.
He did, yes, he did. He did 4 of the episodes. 2 of which are uneventful, actually. So yes, 2.
I hope his wife is watching tonight.
Well, I'm not sure if his wife is still going, but his daughter.
I mean, his daughter. I mean, his daughter. Sorry.
Yeah. Well, I've done so many events in my defense that sometimes they do blur a little bit. But he did do a very good episode called Look, stop me if you've heard this one. But there were these 2 fellas, and it's about these clowns that were this clown school that were killing businessmen and all sorts of things like that. It was kind of a revenge for something that they did to them, and that's one of the Linda Forsden episodes, and that's probably one of the most highly regarded of the show, and that's one of Dennis Spooner's.
Sounds very operatic.
It is quite operatic, and I think some of because the New Avengers is much more of a serious tone. It's more of a precursor, I think, to the Professionals, and it's less fantastical that you would see in the later Down the Rig episodes and the Linda Forsden series. It's less sort of slapstick and sort of, because there's one episode of the Emma Peel series where people are hitting people over the head with science said plow, zap, and like in Batman. So of course by this time that kind of side of it has gone. I remember Brian Clemens saying about Albert Fennell that Albert was very honest. He was almost honest to a fault. And I think when they were trying to negotiate funding for, and it might be another series for the New Avengers, and they had somebody who was very interested to put some of the money up. And Albert said to them, "You do know you could lose all your money as well as make money," and that was enough for them to leave. And Brian was like, "Why do you have to tell them that for?" So I think it was sometimes perhaps not suited to the brutality of the film business, perhaps.
That's why Brian wasn't in charge of the money.
Yeah. But no, and that was Albert. That was Albert who did that. And Brian was the one that was saying, "Don't mention."
I thought Brian said it and Albert was saying, no.
No, it was Albert who reminded the investors you could go down as well as up. But
well, Albert was honest to an extraordinary degree, so that doesn't surprise me.
One of the interesting editing techniques in your episodes is when you sort of go from one scene to another. It's sort of like a film sort of twists. It's sort of like going through a revolving door. So it flips. You've got black either side. So I thought just that was quite a good sort of editing technique to keep sort of the flow and the pace going.
No, you mean in Faces?
Oh yeah, in Faces, and I think it's also in Midas Touch as well. When I look at that, so.
Yeah, I like Midas Touch, by the way. I've just rewatched that as well, and I thought that was quite good. I enjoyed that episode.
Yeah, I think it is. I think it is quite a good one.
Yeah,
And there's in as we're talking about Midas, there's a very good scene where Gambit and Purdy are chasing one of the villains, and there's a shot where there's a it's outside, and they run a long distance to catch him, and the film is speeded up. And I was
yeah.
wondering whether that's would be your choice, or maybe the director would say we want to do that.
I don't know. I don't know, but that's something that I did not like. I didn't like the fact that we'd sped that up.
Yeah,
I don't know how that happened or who suggested it, but could have been me. But in retrospect now, sometimes when I look at movies that I've edited before, I think, oh God, why did I do that? But I was, with everything you do in life, even now, you're always learning, which is the great part about the film business. I always felt that I never stopped learning. So I bet that shot, I don't know. It just doesn't. It looks sped up, so therefore it looks unreal, and so therefore it takes me out of the reality of what I'm watching.
yeah,
So
yeah.
if I was editing that episode again, I would not do that.
Yeah, it could either be argued as being a stylistic choice, or you say it jars you out of the
It jars you out.
episode.
Yeah.
Um,
I remember
and
I
there's
did. I have a similar scene in Sleeper, by the way, which we'll talk about later, I guess. But where Purdy runs a huge distance. Um, uh, she was very athletic, and I shot the shot to take advantage of this ability she had. She ran for about a quarter of a mile without slowing down. And you'll see it in she's running on top of what I think were old railway tracks up off the ground. And it follows her all the way down and then across, and until she comes to the end of the run, and she's looking over a barrier at something. I don't remember what now, but she was very athletic. If you asked her to go over a fence, she'd go over the fence. She wouldn't. She did have a stunt girl who did a lot of the really difficult stuff for her, but even the medium skill stuff she would do herself.
with it in one of Ray Austin's episodes called Target, you see Joanna Lumley climbing up a building, walking on the roof of a building, very sort of narrow, and she did that all herself. You can,
Yeah,
and
yeah. No, I remember that. I remember that episode.
it
Yeah,
was of course Sid Child who trained her and Gareth, and so I think gave
yeah.
them confidence to
Yeah.
do those things.
You said Sid will come on when we talk about Sleeper, right?
She will indeed, yes, yeah. I think
And
so.
is she is she is she still working?
No, she retired quite a while ago to bring up her family basically. But I think for her it was she got there was a certain point where she was got a phone call about a job, and she went, well, why do I want to do that for? And why am I hanging off the side of a train? And I think she said, well, once you start to say, well, I'm not, you start to doubt the work. I think that was when she was thinking, well, I've got
Yeah,
more to lose here, and I need
yeah.
to make sure I don't, because you did have a couple of close calls here and there.
I'll bet. Yeah, it's a good time to quit.
Yes, so I think she made the good decision to
Yeah.
do that. A bit like Ray
Well,
Austin.
it'll be good to see her again. So I hope you can schedule that.
Oh, yes, I'm sure we can. She's always a delight to talk to. Um, I wanted to mention about the story of Faces as we're starting to sort of wind up a little bit. It's it, the doppelganger story is something that you will always if a show if a show runs long enough, you're going to get the point of something about doubles. Do you think, looking back at the episode now, it holds up fairly
Yeah,
well?
I do. Yeah, I do. Of the of the 4, 5 episodes I reviewed in order to be prepared for today, I thought it was one of the best. That one and the Midas Touch, I thought, were of the ones I edited. I thought were were probably most successful for me anyway, personally. Because as I said at the beginning of our talk, I was pleased to see that even I was confused at the end as to who was real and who wasn't, and that was what I was after. And looking at it fresh now, having stuck 48 years in between editing it and looking at it, I was caught up in that aspect of it, which I thought was successful and good. And I liked the episode. I liked the way it was done. There was one aspect of it that I didn't quite understand. It was just a simple little thing. You know how it was all set up that the archer would go in and polish off the original, and then they'd switch. In the middle of the episode, for some reason or other, what was the actor's name who played the archer?
Edward Pepperbridge.
For some reason, Edward was in the car with the person who was being replaced, and they had to jump out of the car in order to chase the person he was supposed to kill with the arrow. And I thought that was clumsy, and I couldn't figure out why on earth we ever did that and why he was in the car to begin with, because he was, being in the car, he's not going to be able to use the bow and arrow at all. And I thought it was a moment that I had to sit back and think, good God, why did we do that? Obviously, it was done that way in the shooting, so it probably was in the script, but why, I don't know.
Yeah, if you look at the way they very efficiently bump off the other originals, it does seem by comparison a bit sloppy. You're right, and it's perhaps it just is an excuse for a good action sequence. I think maybe that's probably what it.
Yeah, but it didn't. It made for one of the clumsy parts of, hopefully you get through each episode without a clumsy section. But I thought this was a clumsy little piece. It didn't go on for very long because he jumped out of the car with the bow and arrow and got the guy anyway. But what the hell he was doing in the car in the first place is beyond my comprehension.
Yeah, well, I think if the story moves along so quickly and if it's edited at a pace, hopefully the audience won't think about that until well, hopefully never.
Hopefully not, but I did as an audience member.
I mean, are you when you watch things, are you always looking at it from a director's and editor's lens, or
No, I never look at anything that way. I just look at it as if I'd never seen it before, and it's just I'm looking at it as hopefully just any other audience member. I never look at things with editing in mind, and I never look at things with. I'm usually aware, obviously, when I think something's badly directed, I can spot that right away. But and I can spot things that I think are badly edited, and I see more and more of that in recent years because. I don't know if I sound like an old fogey now, but in the days of the studios and whatnot, you spend a good amount of time being an assistant. So you learnt your trade, you learnt editing, you learnt all the tricks, you learnt how to do things and make them good versus not so good. And similarly with directing, obviously. And I worked with Bob Altman as an assistant director on probably 5 or 6 movies before I edited one. Nowadays, kids learn to make movies on their iPhone at school. So they have no training whatsoever. They learn by experience or by talking to their peers. By the time they get to film school, they already think they know what they're doing. There's more chance for things to look amateurish, in my opinion. And I find that both with directing and with editing. And I also teach when I can at Pepperdine University here. I have a directing and producing class which I teach, which is more after the style of a workshop, in as much as it's on location. It's not in a lecture hall. And I'm horrified at how little the students pay attention to the script, and they seem to think they can fix it while they're shooting, which of course you can't. Well, you can, but it's extremely difficult to do. But they and a lot of the times when I'm making when they make their own movies at school, at university, they're not very good, and the source of it is usually the script, and which I find surprising as well. So, but I think a lot of it is because of the digital age, and the technology is taking over our lives, not always with success, but and I'm not a big fan of technology. I'm more of a fan of the human brain.
And I think you're right. There's a sense that we can do reshoots and tidy it up later on, which of course is why budgets increase so much on, and why films then are considered to be flops in the cinema, even though they made $500 million, $1 billion. And you think, well, how can that be a failure? But
It's funny you should say that, Philip, because I've frequently said that editing, people ask me what's editing like now compared to then. Editing then, when I was editing then, you did all your thinking before you cut. I would put all my shots around the wall on pegs, and I'd literally have the cutting room surrounded with strips of film hanging off pegs on the wall, and I would put them in the order in which I thought I would cut them. So I would cut the sequence in my head before attempting any editing whatsoever, and that could take 2 or 3 days. Then I would put it all together, and that would usually happen pretty quickly. Then when we started editing digitally, of course, it's so much easier then to cut any old thing, because it takes no time at all to change it. Whereas in the old days, you had to reconstitute everything and then cut all over again, and then you'd have splices all over the place, and then they would break, and it was physically very difficult to do a lot of recutting. So that's why editors tried to make their first cut as close to a possible final cut as they could get. And nowadays it's just thrown together, and then the most of the thinking takes place after the fact, as you just said, which means potentially digital editing could be much quicker, but in fact it's not, because very little thought is put into it going in, and most of the thought happens later, and then it ends up taking you at least the same amount of time, if not more.
And where there was something about having to physically cut film, and the fact that it was hard maybe meant that you had a better creative result because it was sort of more difficult, necessity being the mother of invention, that sort of thing. So maybe it was those kind of struggles that made the better product, perhaps.
Well, I definitely adhere to that train of thought, and I love touching the film. I love the film running through my hands. I sort of felt like I was in touch with what I was doing, literally. And I also looked at the moviola as kind of a motorcycle. It was the motorcycle of film editing. And the good thing about it is that producers could never master the moviola, so they could never come in and look at your film without you being there. Because they would cut their fingers and get their hand caught in the wheels, and it was, you had to be technically capable to edit on a moviola. Flatbeds I didn't much care for. In fact, I prefer digital to flatbeds, but it just, I felt more in touch with the editing. When you're sitting back looking at a screen and banging on a keyboard, you could be doing it, sending an email or editing a movie. It's all the same to me. It's just you're not necessarily in touch with anything, and your mind drifts off. And whereas when you were cutting with your mind engaged in the creative side and your body engaged in the physical side, you were 100% involved in what you were doing. Like car driving, in the old days, you had a gear shift to shift, and you had no power steering, and you had to drive the car. you couldn't sit back and talk on your iPhone because A, there wasn't one, and B, if you did, you'd miss the gear because you needed both hands. You needed one hand on the wheel, one hand on the gear shift, and both feet on the pedals. So you were engaged in driving. Driving was driving. Now it's sitting back in your lounge chair. You might as well be in your living room driving.
Let's make the point that the tactile relationship with things, I think, really helps. And I remember when I was at university doing writing essays, and if I wrote an essay by hand on paper and then typed it up, I got a better score. For some reason, the way the brain works in a sort of analog versus digital, I think that's quite interesting.
Yeah, I think, well, it's also obviously because you spend more time thinking about it. And when you visually see it, you're committing it to memory that way too, even though you're not really aware of it necessarily. But vision plays a good role in any creative endeavor.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. We mentioned speeding up footage earlier, and there is a little bit in Faces actually where Gambit's dragged across the floor, and that's sped up slightly. But that is less notable. That's more, I think, to a pacing.
Yeah, where was that, Philip? Say it again.
There's a bit in Faces where Gambit is masquerading as the Irish drunk, and
Right.
he's dragged into the cell to sober up. And I think that bit, if I'm remembering correctly, I think it's that part of the episode, and that's sped up a little bit. But I think that's
Oh,
just
yeah.
to sort of, I think that's just a pacing thing. And again, if you're not watching it with a view to say doing an analysis like we are, you probably wouldn't notice it. But
No,
that's
that one you wouldn't notice. No, it's not as obvious as the running one.
yeah. And I think you mentioned how successful the episode is. I think one of the things for me that maybe didn't work was the fact that Steed has a double, and it's not just politicians. So you kind of exaggerating the rules of coincidence and chance by having too many doubles. And I think also the bullet being caught by the watch, I think it is probably a bit of a cliche even back in the mid-70s. So whether that's kind of a little bit of a,
Well, also in Cybernauts, there's no way that flimsy piece of sheet metal is going to stop any bullet. He was the Cybernaut was supposed to be impervious to gunshots. I didn't believe that for 1 second.
yeah, Cybernauts is a very good one. And again, you probably would have looked at the previous Cybernaut episodes in preparation for that. I assume.
No, I didn't have those available. So, but I vaguely remember them. Yeah.
And you say that Cybernauts is the one that sticks out a bit more than the others.
Yeah, I thought the story was interesting, and I thought the actor who played the fella in the wheelchair with the mask on was particularly good. Who was he?
Well, the character is Felix Kane. The actual actor, I will tell you in a second. I think the actor was quite known for Robert Lang.
Robert
Robert
Lang.
Lang.
I thought he did a great job. I remember thinking that whilst I was editing it, I thought that he was particularly, surprisingly in those kinds of circumstances where his face is completely obscured, he still manages to give a very dramatic and emotional performance.
I think it has a very distinctive voice there because it's essentially a vocal performance, isn't it? So
It is totally. Yeah.
and how they've
And occasionally you saw his eyes, but not very often.
and you occasionally see the scarring, and it's left very much to the imagination, which I think makes it even more horrific.
Yes.
And so that might have been perhaps maybe the first one you might have cut, perhaps, or
Don't know. In fact, I don't know what sequence of the four I cut, what order would they have been in?
well, if well, I would say, well, Midas Touch would have been the first, then Cybernauts, Cat Amongst the Pigeons and Faces. That could be either either way around, but I certainly would have said that Midas is before Cybernauts. So I'm guessing that they've all been turned in, probably been shot fairly close together, because of course to make your time work for the studio, etc., you wouldn't go away for too long, so you would kind of sort of do the four in almost like a block, I would imagine.
And are you sure there wasn't another editor working with me? Because usually on a series there's two, and you alternate episodes.
Just quickly check. Uh,
Because
Well,
it's
Cybernaut, you're the single editor for that one in terms of credited. Of course, they
the
don't always credit
prime.
everybody
Yeah.
on these shows. I was speaking to a makeup artist recently who is credited for 2 episodes of the original Avengers, and he actually worked on about 33 of them. So it's not always complete.
No, and I noticed that on this day and age when we were doing the Avengers, none of the sound editors or the assistant editor, or I was the only editing person given any credit.
Yeah, you've got on all your episodes, it's just literally
Yeah,
yourself. I
there's
mean,
no other member of the editing department is mentioned.
no, I mean with the sound, we know that you had the dubbing editors are Sam Cordis, Gordon McCullum.
Oh, that's right. That they did get credit. That's right.
Yes,
Yeah.
they've got credited. Yes, but you wouldn't have but as you said, a sound editor wouldn't be
But
on here.
But usually, Philip, while you're looking up there, episodes have two editors who alternate episodes, so that because you, as the editor, you have to stick with it, or you should, through the mixing in the studio, through all the sound editing, and so by the time you finish your episode, the other episode would have finished shooting. And so that editor would then be working on that one, and then you would go back onto the upcoming one.
There is an Paul B. Clay is credited as post-production coordinator.
Yeah, Paul Clay was the post-production coordinator, but he was just keeping all the post-production working and on schedule. He had nothing to do. He was not a creative element in the post-production. He basically kept us on schedule.
Yeah, he's the only one that's listed under the editorial, but that's literally it.
Yeah, but he had a very important job.
I'm interested to see if I haven't been able to find out either way whether Paul is still with us or not.
Yeah.
There's quite a few question marks on a few people. I mean, would you have had much to do with production manager Ron Purdy, for example?
Yeah, I remember Ron. I mean, I didn't. Production manager is not a person the editor generally engages with, because his job is all set related, and he's trying to get the upcoming locations set up and the sets built and the this, what, and the other. So you'd know him because he was part of the crew, but you wouldn't have any direct communication with him unless he needed to tell you something, or vice versa.
And I get Ron I've spoken very briefly to, but he doesn't unfortunately want to engage in anything like this. But he's still around. He hasn't answered some of my messages recently, which when people get of a certain age and they don't get back to you, you tend to worry a little bit. But I think he's still with us.
Well, there's another one. You see, I'm not sure where Brian came up with the Purdy name.
Oh, yes,
It might have been from Ron.
we did sort of vaguely cover this, and I think Ron did say he does have the Purdy bike that appears in the Tale of the Big Y episode. He's still got that. But originally Purdy was going to be called Charlie, so that changed, and I think it's a reference to a gun. I think there was Purdy.
Is it? I wouldn't mind betting. I wouldn't mind knowing Brian. I wouldn't mind betting it was referring to his name. He probably liked the sound of the name, like Clifford and Pemberton, and he was always picking up names from crew members.
There was definitely a weapon called well, it was I can't remember now whether it was the manufacturer or it was the make of a or was a particular gun they produced, but I think there was
Well,
that.
that could be as well. Yeah.
But knowing Brian, you should say it might be a mixture of the two.
Right.
Um, so you said you would have sat
Oh,
down.
by the way, I've remembered the other one in my episode, in my directing episode, Sleeper. The doctor who at the very beginning does the exhibition, for want of a better word, of the sleeping gas or drug. His name was Dr. Graham.
Oh, right.
So there's another one. I got Clifford and Graham in in two different episodes.
You always wonder sometimes at how Wright comes up with names for people and
Well,
places.
Brian was particularly prone to putting crew members in as cast member names because he liked the idea of doing it.
Was Brian interested in the editing process? Would he occasionally kind
Oh
of
yeah, oh very much so. Yeah, yeah, very much so. Yeah. He would come in. He would represent it was the interaction between myself and Brian and Albert was mostly with Brian on a creative level. When he would come into the editing room after the director had finished.
You must talk about the performances of the three leads in this episode because I think it's particularly Gareth Hunt and Joanne Lumley in terms of playing themselves, playing doubles. You know, I think it's quite a good. I imagine this one they probably would enjoy quite a lot from the
Yeah,
leads.
no, it was good. It was good because you know that whole business between Joanna and Gareth for me never worked. They never seemed to have any connection romantically at all. And the fact that you were supposed to read that into certain moments of them together, I never thought it came across. I don't know quite why, but I don't know. You know, the two of them just may not have been on the same page. You know.
It's an interesting dynamic having a three leads and it's sort of
Yeah.
which of course it's one of the reasons why New Avengers is so distinctive because you have that a different dynamic. But I think fans will debate
Yeah,
whether
you know, the same thing was I was involved with another series here, the name of which I can't remember off the top of my head because I did a few of them, but and they added a third person after the first couple of series, and that didn't work either. I think you know, no slight towards Gareth, but you know, the Avengers was better when it was just two people, you know.
yeah
Steed and Emma Peel was all you needed, and you know, and Steed and Joanna was really all you would have needed. I don't know why they thought they needed a third person.
well my understanding is there was kind of two reasons. One was that Patrick was a few years older and I think he had arthritis and it would have
Yeah,
made in some of the physical bits they needed somebody to come in to do some of the legwork, and maybe it may also have been perhaps considered that because of Patrick's age, maybe that kind of traditional romantic interest would perhaps be seen as a bit inappropriate, and maybe they wanted a younger guy to provide the romantic sort of.
yeah, I think both of those reasons are very valid, and of course I'm sure that's why they did it. But it was I think, nevertheless, that's two series I've worked on where a third person was added to detrimental effect, I felt. But of course, you're right. There'd be the romantic thing between Steed and Joanna would not have existed. And also Steed was, I remember from when I was working on the series and doing Sleeper, he had a very limited physical range.
So you said is that Patrick? Did you say?
Patrick, yeah.
Yeah.
So if Gareth hadn't been there, then Patrick, you know, could not have basically. Well, he couldn't do what Gareth could do. There's no way.
No. And I think that the fans, I think, to imagine the Avengers without Gareth Hunt, I think would be quite sacrilege in respect that there is so much affection, I think, for Gareth Hunt, and particularly, I think, only enhanced by his very sad passing at in his 60s. And I think you know I think Avengers fans could feel quite protective, I think, of
Yeah.
Graham Hunt and Gambit, because of everyone says he was a lovely guy to begin with, and
Oh, he was fabulous. He was very, very easy to direct, took direction extremely well, and was a great motivator on set.
but yeah,
I mean, he was, and I don't mean which is why I said at the very beginning of my comments, I don't mean this to be directed at Gareth personally at all, but sometimes, and in this instance, it was necessary because there was so many years had passed since the previous incarnation that, like you say, it was almost inevitable that they would have to bring in somebody.
and I think there was a big reunion for the Avengers at Chichester University in 2011, and that was when I met Ray Austin and Sid, and there was lots of panels and things, and there's about 300 fans brought in, all kinds of ages, and I remember sitting down waiting for a panel to begin, and there was this controversy that Diana Rigg didn't attend, and
Sorry,
there
who
was a bit of a
didn't who didn't attend?
Oh, Diana Rigg was invited to the convention,
Oh,
but
and she didn't come. Huh?
no, and the fans are kind of sort of discussing that, and they said Gareth would have come, and they kind of sort of there was a bit
Yeah,
of weight that they, and
yeah,
Brian Brian read a letter he sent to Diana to ask her to come. It was a very sweet letter, and he ended it with "Mrs. Peel, you're needed," and all that sort of thing. And she was
was
quite,
Joanna there?
Joanna did do a video message, but she wasn't. I think he had a conflict.
Right, right.
I think but Honor Blackman and lots of other people were there, and but yes, there's just an example of people's reaction to Gareth and Diana's relationship
Yeah,
with the show a little bit.
yeah.
And just get nerdy for a second, they bought a new Avengers trading card set out a few years ago, and they had autograph cards randomly inserted. And I got a Gareth Hunt card, and I was quite excited that that was probably the one that I wanted out of all of them. So it just shows his appeal as a
Yeah.
character. But this episode, I think, particularly, is quite a good Gambit episode. It's very much Gambit and
Yes, it is.
Purdy.
Yes, you're right. It is, and it also deals with their relationship in a much more interesting way, instead of just these sort of asides that when like, for instance, when she was going to leave the room and he was in bed and she was trying to wake him up, and I don't know which episode this was in, but he flopped on the floor. His bed was moved back into the wall, and he flopped on the floor, and she said, "I'm staying here because if I don't stay in this room," he says, "I've got to get dressed." And she said, "Well, I'm staying here because if I don't stay in this room, you won't hurry along." And he says, "And I don't wear pajamas, Purdy." And she says, "Up, see you outside." Yeah, so it was those little interactions between them. I thought some of them were successful, some of them were not.
Oh yeah, yeah. And I think had the show had more of a longevity, maybe they kind of would have got that balance a bit.
I'm sure that relationship would have gone somewhere. Exactly.
I think it might have been Cybernauts that with the bed, possibly. I'd have to check.
Yeah.
There is quite a very good action sequence in Faces where Purdy is fighting the Archer, and arrows being shot at her, and so how easy is it to edit action? Do you find that?
Yeah,
Is that
editing action to me is easier than editing drama, performances. Performances you have to spend a lot more time on because it's a lot more subtle.
yeah
Starting off with who you decide to be on at any point in a given scene, because you're not, as an editor, you're not always on the person who's speaking. So you have to decide whether you're going to be on the person who's speaking, on the person who's listening, or if there are more than two people in the room, who you're going to be on, so and then it comes down to performances. So you've got that to weigh. And action is usually pretty simple because there's usually only one way to put it together to make it work. And if you have a good stunt coordinator who directs the stunts, knowing what will work and what doesn't. And so the stunt coordinator typically has a very good idea of editing and what's possible, much more so than most directors. And and so they shoot it in such a way that pretty obvious what was intended and how the shots are meant to go together. Of course, there's a lot of freedom in there as well, but when you're talking to the stunt coordinator, you generally have a very detailed conversation about he has a very detailed conversation with you or she about how it should go together. So you aim for that to begin with, but then as you go along, you'll find things that will work better another way. But generally speaking, I find cutting action to be pretty simple.
Good, yeah. One thing I should mention is Joanna Lumley's performance as Alita, and I think it's almost like a precursor to Absolutely Fabulous and Patsy. I think there's a certain Mark one about it, isn't there?
Yeah, she was rehearsing.
Yes, so,
yeah, no. But I wanted to say one other thing too, because sometimes when you get Academy Awards and BAFTA awards for editing, oftentimes I notice that movies that have a lot of action sequences in it get the award, which is, I think, mostly because people don't have a clue what editing entails, and so they think that editing action sequences is extremely difficult and complicated, but it's the other way around. And a very quiet movie can and often does require a lot more skill on the part of the editor to bring out the story and to bring out the performances. A lot of performances, not surprisingly, are enhanced or spoiled by the editor, and it has a heavy weight on who gets nominated as an actor. Because if you're very careful about the takes you choose, and the pieces of the takes you choose, I mean, you can spend 2 weeks just cutting one scene. So anyway, I just want to throw that in.
Yeah, I think about it in an action scene, the action will become very laborious and kind of, just pointless if you're not interested in the characters and the story. So that obviously,
right.
So if you as an editor aren't bringing out those emotions, some cases very complex and difficult changes, no one's going to care about a 10-minute action sequence, are they?
Yeah, well, I was actually thinking about the movies that have no action sequences at all.
Well, in that case,
I mean, they oftentimes require more skill as an editor. But nowadays, of course, you get action movies that have nothing but action. So the plot, if any, is pretty unimportant.
One action sequence I should mention for Midas Touch is there's a big car chase. Purdy and Gambit are chasing the villain, and they're having a conversation about films as they're doing the chase. So you've got, of course, to keep the logistics of the conversation with the car spins and all that. So that struck me as quite a meaty sequence.
Yeah, that was interesting for me as the editor because of that very thing. I had to keep the conversation going and somehow kind of let the audience think that they would in fact be having that conversation under the circumstances they were in, which would be actually extremely unlikely. So that was a conceit on the part of Brian, but it was a good one. I mean, okay, so it probably in reality would never have happened because you'd be fully engaged in the chase. You wouldn't be thinking about movies, but it worked.
And it was a very Avengers type thing to do as well.
It was a very Avengers thing to do. Yeah.
Having watched the episode again, is there bits that you think Any other bits that you are really quite happy with as an editor? You think that hold up? We mentioned, of course, speeding up and things don't really quite sort of might date it a little bit, but overall, do you think Faces holds together as a bit of television?
Yeah, well, as I said, I think the most satisfying thing for me is the fact that in a lot of instances, particularly towards the end, you're not sure who's real and who isn't. And I think that was very vital to the success of the episode, because in the beginning you knew the guy that you were looking at was a phony because you saw the original one get bumped off. But even in this one, with the end there with the three principals, you weren't sure when they were offed, so to speak. You weren't sure whether they actually got the right person. I tried to cut it so that the archer could well have hit the wrong person, because they were both running around in different directions, and particularly Steed, if I remember correctly. And I thought, and even watching it again, I thought, oh my God, he shot the wrong person. He shot the original Steed and not the or they mean he shot the ring in Steve and not the original, But so I thought all of that. I thought that actually ended up very successfully. And since the whole episode depended upon that, really, that was the most important thing for me.
Yeah, I think Steed, being strange with Wendy Clifford and about the watch and everything, and he obviously wants to keep it secret that he, just in case he meets one of those doubles, he doesn't know who to trust. That's why.
Right.
But yeah, I think you are wanting, I think, to the very last second.
Yeah.
Is
But you were right earlier too. All the episodes, all the Avengers episodes, stretch credibility. You're not likely to find anywhere near the number of close lookalikes in a home or a drunk tank. You're not. I mean, it's just not going to happen. So and also it would take a considerable amount of time to do that much plastic surgery.
yes.
They're not going to be ready to go in a minute. They're going to be ready to go in about 6 months.
Yeah, and I think if you look at some celebrities that have plastic surgery these days, it isn't that good. So you think it wouldn't be quite as convincing as it's supposed to be. But I suppose for the sake of a 50-minute TV episode, I think it probably holds up.
I think it was perfectly acceptable.
Yeah, I think so, and it's. I think it has a very good script as well. I think Brian and Dennis, I think, turned in a very good. There is a very good suspense.
I agree. Yeah.
Yeah. And was it because I don't think we'll come back to Cybernauts again, but was there anything from Cybernauts that particularly struck you, other than we mentioned, of course, the character Felix Kane, and was there anything else?
Well, it was just looking at the 48-year-old interpretation of what a Cybernaut would look like,
Yes.
and how, quite frankly, ineffective they would have been. And apart from his slice, which he sort of used on everybody and everything with his arm, he didn't really have any other abilities except to crush things in his fist. And like I said earlier, I didn't believe for 1 second that that armor he was wearing would stop a bullet. It looked like it was tinfoil.
Yes, it does a little bit, unfortunately. While I think of it, the continuity lady for, I think, most of your episodes was a lady called Renee Glynn. Did you ever have anything much to do with continuity, or were you kind of aware of how important they were?
Yeah. In both capacities, an editor speaks to the continuity person a lot to find out, about different takes and what was. There's always mistakes about which take should have been printed and which take wasn't printed, and also as a director, I have even more conversations with the script supervisor because I use the script supervisor as another pair of eyes other than mine. And I generally, when I'm hiring a script supervisor, which of course was not the case in the Avengers, it's not the case on any series because they're always on long before you. But when I hire a script supervisor for a feature, for a theatrical film, I take a lot of time with that particular hire because I rely on them very much for their opinions and their ability to look at the story and analyze it. And so, yes, I respect continuity people enormously, and I have a great deal to do with them in both capacities, both as an editor and a director. And I noticed that the lady you mentioned used to be the second unit continuity person, and on my directing episode, she was my continuity girl. So at some point, either on my episode or the one preceding, she must have been upgraded from second unit to the main unit.
Yes, but very, very possible because it was Renee and a lady called Pat Rambert.
Yeah, but Pat Rambo, I think, was the original second unit girl. If I
They might have, yeah, at the very least, they might have alternated the roles.
Yeah, they might have alternated, or sometimes one of them goes off to do a movie, and leaves the series. And I may be wrong too, but I just seem to remember that one of them used to be second unit and then came onto the main unit.
Yeah, Renee did do a couple of second units actually on the original Avengers series, so she might have perhaps been on second unit with you. And I did a few events with Renee over the years, and because she even though she was 94, I think, when we were doing some of the events, but very, very sharp mind, as you might expect somebody that had that kind of attention to detail. She could remember, 45 years ago like it was yesterday. So I was always very impressed with how sharp she was.
Yeah, no, I find that invaluable in a continuity person, and continuity people are often just dismissed as, oh well, and they when you're teaching in college, I've been asked, why do we need a continuity person? Well, if they try to make a film without a continuity person, they quickly find out why.
Because I think may not. I think for those that perhaps are new to, film, or their interest in film is starting, the fact they do not, they might not necessarily think that it's not shot in order, or and of course, once you start to think, well, this was shot a month ago, now you're picking it up, and you've got to have the time the same, or what they're eating is the same, and it comes quite sort of
Well, those kinds of abilities of a script supervisor, I don't question. They're doing that in the background for me, and I don't, unless I notice something, I will never sort of try to catch up with that. But my use of a script supervisor is way more story oriented, and performance oriented. Now that everything's digital, you don't actually ever have to pick out takes to print and takes not to print. You just print everything. I mean, you don't print anything; it's just all there. So, but when you had to save money if you did 10 takes, you're not going to print every take except if you're Sam Peckinpah. And I edited a movie for Sam Peckinpah. He would print everything. At the end of the movie I did for him, we had 1 million feet of dailies, over 1 million feet. So I calculated it would take me 3 or 4 months just to look at the dailies without cutting anything. Wow. So I had an editing team of 4 people because I couldn't stay on top of it, everything. But but that's, anyway, getting back to script supervisor, I use a script supervisor more in that realm than just worrying about the tie.
Yeah. I think the only thing that when they said that she occasionally annoyed her was when an editor had to make a story decision or a take decision, which meant that continuity had to kind of be sidestepped. She understood why, but sometimes you had to
True. And I would frequently have those conversations with script supervisors because as an editor, I know what I can get away with and what I can't get away with. And you can get away with an enormous amount of continuity errors, depending upon what they are, you know. And unless someone studies the movie and plays it through in slow motion and is a complete fan of that particular movie or episode, the average viewer will never spot it.
No, no. And I think if they are spotting it, that it's
And if they are watching it, they're looking at the wrong thing anyway.
yes, yeah. And just to finish off, I think the episode ended in a very nice way with Steve looking directly at the camera and saying,
Oh,
irreplaceable, about Purdy. And
yeah, no, I thought that was great. That was the only time I've ever known that to happen.
yeah, I can't think of many situations where they've done that,
Yeah,
before.
yeah, no, I thought that was a good way to end it. It really, really good.
And I think it summarizes the Avengers itself, is that it is, you couldn't remake it. It is Patrick Macnee. It is on a
Yeah.
back.
Yeah, and in fact, Philip, when I saw that again just recently, when I reviewed the episode, I had forgotten about that, and I thought, that they should have ended every episode with him saying something directly in the camera. It would have been a great tagline for the entire series, and Patrick would have come up with something really witty most of the time, even if Brian didn't.
That's interesting idea, yes, because the original Avengers series, when it was sold to America, because they had so many commercial breaks, they would finish the episode and then come back with a tag that was often nothing to do with what you had seen in the episode, but just so the audience would come back for the last joke setup and just a little
Yeah.
bit. So that could have been, say, a way to sort of
Yeah. And I actually did notice that in a couple of the episodes I watched, that after what was obviously a commercial break, that I was watching it without the commercial break, of course, but I knew there would have been one there. We often came back to a very brief summarization of what had just happened before the commercial break, which is, of course, when you watch it without the commercial break, it's not necessary.
So when you're cutting, you have to bear in mind that you're going to have to go to a break and
Yeah.
influence.
Yeah, so you have to lead it back in again. Now, a lot of series never did do that, but the Avengers didn't do it at every commercials break, but now and again they would.
Yeah, yeah. I suppose different networks across the world would want more or less commercial breaks, so they would kind of have to decide when to do it. So you
No, well, that's another sore point. The commercial breaks are very well identified. So overseas, no matter what country it is, they're supposed to do it exactly when they're told to do it.
right.
However, when these episodes get out of hand and not out of hand, but when they go overseas and they're not supervised by anybody from the original production or even the network or the BBC or whatever, all sorts of horrible stuff happens. They can cut the thing off sooner just to get more commercials in. So the commercial break can actually be longer than it was originally intended to be, and in order to make it longer, either the beginning or the end or both, leading into or out of the commercial breaks, gets cut off. So the story is damaged as well.
There was a lot of complaints. I think at the moment, channel Great TV shows that they've got an Avengers season at the moment. Actually, they're doing 3 episodes a night, one of which being a new Avengers, and fans are going online, and obviously we're very passionate, so these things come up, and they're saying about how the episodes are being cut in some cases quite dramatically to extend those ad breaks. So yes, it's very much a problem.
And it used to happen with theatrical films too. I have to say, yeah, one of mine was butchered by that, and also another film that I was involved with was recut by the producer. I think this was The Man Who Fell to Earth, which was another film I edited for Nick Rogue with David Bowie.
Yeah.
And the producer on that movie, years after it was finished, decided that it was too long and incomprehensible. So he did his own version of it and released it with no permission from anybody. And
Yeah.
and it was completely panned by the audience, who said, "What the hell are you doing? This is dreadful." And the original movie was 1,000% better.
Yeah.
And so he had to retract, and there was all sorts of to do about that. But I mean, Nick Road was not even informed.
That's you do hear sometimes a film being taken away from directors and there to prior to release, but
Yeah.
to have it kind of after the fact, that's quite interesting. Sort of
Yeah.
sort of
Well, the picture I said I did Convoy with Sam Peckinpah, which was taken away from him by EMI, who at that time financed the movie, and so I had to be the go-between between Sam and the producers, because Sam was technically off the movie, but he would call me all the time and ask me what was going on, and I was in this awkward position of having to do what the producers wanted and justify it to Sam. And obviously I had my own opinion about this whole thing anyway. So I was not only representing Sam's point of view, but my own.
Yeah.
And then theirs. So it was a really muddled situation. When you take a director off a movie, it's not a good idea.
Oh, no, not at all. So was the Band Fell to Earth a good experience at the time of doing it?
Oh yeah. Yeah. No, but the two movies I did with Nick were both great experiences.
Did David Bowie give a lot of alternates? Was he one of those actors that give you a lot of different takes and
He would, but he wouldn't announce them. He'd just do it. So
yeah.
so you wouldn't. A lot of actors will say, "I'm going to try something different." And you go, "Okay, fine," but he would just do it, and then he was sort of trying it out himself,
Well,
because
yeah.
he wasn't a full cinematic actor like cinematic actors are. He was not surprisingly, his main focus was in the music business, and but he was a pretty good actor. I mean, he was smart enough to know how to act, and so he did a really good job on that movie, I thought.
Oh yeah.
And he was detached enough from it, which enhanced the feeling that he really was from somewhere else.
He does have this otherworldly quality that made him
Yeah.
so good in things like Labyrinth, and
Yeah.
and I think you do, as whenever you see a performance from him, you think you would have liked him to do a lot more acting. I think it would have
Yeah.
been.
Yeah. I was lucky enough to spend a lot of time with him, because when he was in his hotel room on days that he wasn't working, which wasn't that many, of course, I would spend some time with him then, talking about editing and what I was doing, and I would show him bits and pieces, and so it was fun, talking to him on that level.
It was a nice guy to sort of spend time with. It sounds
Oh
like.
yeah, very much so.
Well, I don't think we can top a David Bowie story, so maybe that's a nice point to end it on. Thank you very much, Graham, for talking about Faces with me this evening. It's been really a fantastic chat, and I look forward to talking to you later about a couple of other projects.
Well, it's been a great pleasure for me, Philip, and the questions were great, and I've enjoyed answering all of them.
Oh, that's very kind. Thank you. Yeah, I look forward to our next chat. It's been really fun.
Yeah, good. Okay, thanks a lot, Philip. So talk to you soon.
We'll do. Take care, Graham.
Bye.